Disability and a Good Life, Zhuangzi's philosophy. I've chosen here as the artwork. It's actually part of a work called Flowers and Butterflies, and it's attributed to Ma Quan, who was active in the 18th century. If the attribution is right, this is a female artist, and it has, I felt so bad chopping up the artwork, but if you look at the dimensions, it's 2.5 meters wide. So there's no way I could have properly represented it here. So I've chosen the picture of butterflies here for a reason. You know that in earlier lectures I've used statues, for instance, of Mozi and Kongzi Confucius, and then even with Lao Tzu, there's a painting of Lao Tzu being on an ox. I didn't feel I could properly represent Zhuangzi. And also, of course, there's the famous butterfly story in the Zhuangzi. And I haven't got it on the slides, but I'll read it to you. Once Zhuangzi dreamed he was a butterfly flitting and fluttering around, happy with himself and doing as he pleased. He didn't know he was Zhuangzi. Suddenly he woke up, and there he was, in the flesh and unmistakably Zhuangzi. But he didn't know if he was Zhuangzi who had dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he was Zhuangzi. Between Zhuangzi and a butterfly, there must be some distinction. This is what we mean by the transformation of things. And the translation is adapted from Burton Watson's translation of the story. The butterfly dream is often discussed in scholarship in philosophy to talk about the question of personal identity, sometimes to talk about consciousness and the different forms of consciousness in dream or waking states. But I think it is primarily a story about transformation. It's a story about how the world takes us along and we are transformed, and even in the waking state, Zhuangzi doesn't really know how to conclude with is he now the butterfly dreaming as Zhuangzi, or was it Zhuangzi dreaming he's the butterfly? I'll say a little bit more about transformation in this talk as well. So when we encounter this butterfly dream story, there are so many perspectives we could take. First, the story opens with the butterfly who doesn't even know the butterfly is Zhuangzi. And that's what the story tells us, that the butterfly didn't know he was Zhuangzi. And then there's Zhuangzi's dream state, and then Zhuangzi's waking state. And then there's the narrator's perspective, and then there's our perspective as the reader. And sometimes I think with the Zhuangzi's discussions of transformation, we readers should just relax and enjoy the perspectives, maybe not ask too many questions. But maybe I'm going to do something contrary to that. I'm going to ask quite a lot of questions in relation to perspectives today. The Zhuangzi, a Taoist text whose composition began during the Warring States period, is witty, playful, and subversive. It uses both speaking and silent animals, and ordinary and not so ordinary human beings to present different perspectives on the world. There are many nuances in its stories, and it's not uncommon for readers to see a new connection among a story's elements on their umpteenth reading of the story. Now, texts during the Warring States often use quite a few anecdotes. So if you encounter the Confucian text, for instance, there are anecdotes that are drawn upon this king and that sage, and this is what they did. They knew to build canals, they knew to say this, they knew to calm the crowd, etc. So these are anecdotes, and they were part of a shared discourse. People talk about the sage king Yao and Shun. We encountered the culture hero Fuxi. So this was all part of their shared discourse. They drew upon these examples to illustrate their arguments. In the Zhuangzi, we don't find too many anecdotes. Instead, we find stories. And I think there's a reason why. I won't speculate. Maybe you can draw your own conclusions when you start reading and comparing the texts. So in the Zhuangzi, different features of a story or features across a number of stories catch our attention. As for example, why do some animals speak while others don't? Or why does a figure have such a strange name? We've come across the wheelwright who is called Flat. And then the cicada catcher who isn't known as a cicada catcher. We're just told he catches cicadas, but his name is Hunchback. And readers are prompted, because of these oddities, to take on different perspectives, first of one animal, then of another, of a person, and then another, and then as a reader. Sometimes the stories are left hanging without resolution, as if the Zhuangzi is deliberately refusing to tell us how it concludes. Here's a little bit about the text. As far as we know, the Zhuangzi was originally a 52-chapter text, but sometime in the 3rd century CE, so quite a while after the Warring States period, which finished up in 221 BCE. So in the 3rd century CE, an influential thinker, Guo Xiang, edited it, and now we have 33 chapters. Guo Xiang wrote some notes about how he bunched the chapters together, the inner chapters, for instance, which he considered to be truly the works of the person Zhuangzi. But he never said what happened to the other 19 chapters. They may not have been discarded. I think part of me thinks they might have been consolidated into the existing 33 chapters. So let's explore the idea of perspectives further with the opening story of the Zhuangzi. There are so many perspectives we can take here. There's a little large fish, there's a big bird, there's a fledgling, and there's a cicada. So the little large fish sounds odd. It is by size a large fish, but its name is Kun, which means fish roe. This is Zhuangzi just being humorous, being witty, and you just, I believe, getting us to imagine all sorts of possibilities. And then there's the large fish becomes a big bird, so there's some transformation going on here. And then there are two onlookers, a fledgling dove and the cicada. There is a fish in the northern oblivion named Kun, and this Kun is quite huge. So this is in itself funny if you think this little fish roe or tiny little fish is quite huge. Spanning who knows how many thousands of miles, he transforms into a bird named Peng, and this Peng has quite a back on him, stretching who knows how many thousands of miles. When he rouses himself and soars into the air, his wings are like clouds draped across the heavens. The oceans start to churn, and this big bird begins his journey toward the southern oblivion, that is the pool of heaven. The story is written almost like a story for a child. It says this fish is so big, I don't know how many thousands of miles it spans. This bird is so large, I don't know how many thousands of miles. Again, the span of his wings. And Peng, the name, means wings. One can't help but think the author is deliberately inciting our imagination by refusing to specify a number. For even to specify a number already tells us how to think and how big these creatures are. Between Kun and Peng, there are two characters, but there's only one individual, just as in the butterfly dream story. So first there is Kun, and Kun transforms into a giant bird. Readers are not told why, nor how, and the rhythm of the story takes us along. with the transformation mentioned but not highlighted or in any way emphasized. This conveys precisely, I think, what the Zhuangzi wants to say about transformation. Regarding transformation, there are natural processes that take place, spontaneously, so to speak, outside anyone's control, but which sometimes affect individuals. And the same holds for the transformation in the Zhuangzi butterfly story as well. In this story, transformation comes as no surprise to Peng, the large bird, even if readers are curious about it. Simply put, we're not told why the transformation happens. The story reflects life. Change happens, we may not know why or how, nor is it ours to ask sometimes. We respond to it as Peng does. He flies. Peng's response is paradigmatic, I believe, particularly as we note that from Kun's being in the water, Peng is in the skies. The story continues with how, being as large as it is, Peng's flying sets off gales and how he needs the support of the wind under him in order to fly. Here in this text, it's quite a long text, so I won't have it all up on the PowerPoint. So Peng's perspective is emphasized there about his largeness and his flying and what is needed to support his flying. What is most interesting as we move on next to look at are the perspectives of the two onlookers, the fledgling and the cicada, who half marvel at Peng's flight and who half write it off because they say that kind of flight is surely not possible. Unlike Peng, the little dove and the cicada speak. They converse, which is most interesting. The cicada and the fledgling dove laugh at him, saying, "We scurry up into the air, leaping from the elm to the sandalwood tree, and when we don't quite make it, we just plummet to the ground. What's all this about ascending 90,000 miles and heading south?" It's not clear which one of them speaks, but they share the same view, at least in this story. They are aware of their own limitations, saying that they only fly to a certain height. But they do not have high order awareness of how their experiences affect their understanding of the world. In other words, they know their flying is limited, but they do not know that their flying experiences limit their understanding. From their perspective, if they cannot fly too high, neither would, perhaps should, anyone else be able to. They're locked into this way of viewing the world, lodged in this one perspective. If we look at their final question in this passage, what's all this about ascending 90,000 miles and heading south? That's not set up to elicit answers. It's really a question that sounds colloquially like, what on earth is this flying at 90,000 miles about? In contrast to their close-mindedness, Peng's flight represents the wandering, the you, and that's the character for wandering, advocated in the Zhuangzi. And incidentally, this is the opening story of the Zhuangzi. And Zhuangzi's chapter 1 is entitled Xiao Yao Yu, which has often been translated as carefree wandering. The Zhuangzi's idea of wandering suggests not aimlessness so much as not anticipating one's destination, a fixed target. You is a concept not about the destination, but about how we as individuals understand the destination. And carefree is what the Zhuangzi advocates. The wanderer does not ask, "Mom, are we there yet?" Peng wonders. As a response to its transformation, Peng's wandering exemplifies its open-mindedness. Then fish, then bird, first water, then skies, then proceeding as bird. And perhaps a non-speaking animal such as Peng represents a feature of Taoist philosophy that Taoist insights are ineffable. For in speaking, we articulate how much we know, and we entrench ourselves and others in it, like the fledgling and the cicada. Nonetheless, the contrast between the fledgling and cicada on the one hand and Peng on the other is not so much between speaking and doing as between those whose experiences limit them in such a way that they cannot understand other perspectives. As readers, we may take on different perspectives. We may imagine we are the littler creatures with their limitations, or we may take on the perspective of Heng to contemplate its wandering. Or we could have the perspective of the reader, of course, who understands that the little creature's experiences are limiting. And then we should ask ourselves, where do we place ourselves in this story? The Zhuangzi also uses stories about modest, ordinary people who undertake their everyday activities to provide a different perspective on life. Different, that is, from the models of excellence that were proposed by those in official life penned by the privileged of that time. The Zhuangzi stories were articulated at the time when the views of ordinary people were not represented in texts, written for and circulating among officials. There were texts for ordinary people, but they weren't circulated or circulating among the officials as part of their debates and discourse. As readers of the Zhuangzi, we should also ask why these activities would have a place in a text that hoped to engage with official discourse. All in all, the Zhuangzi's perspectives are most welcome, important counterpoints to those associated with the highly regarded intellectual and moral achievements of officials. In the last lecture, we had already encountered a few of the Zhuangzi stories in some detail, including those of the wheelmaker and the cicada catcher. I use the word ordinary deliberately to capture the tone of the Zhuangzi. Undertaking activities that involve mainly manual capacities, again another juxtaposition with those who lead, these men take their accomplishments to great height. But because their skills are celebrated by implication, their activities do not have to be of a kind that society deems worthwhile in order to be excellent. Nor does the handling of activities need to be virtuous, although it is virtuosic. This is the notion of De in Taoist philosophy, one that I touched on ever so briefly in the previous lecture. De highlights an individual's potency in responding to the world. In the Confucian tradition, De is properly translated virtue, but in the Taoist tradition, it's more appropriate to think about it in terms of virtuosity or potency. And I'll come back to this towards the end of this evening's lecture. Insofar as these ordinary individuals excel in their everyday tasks, they challenge our biases about worthwhile pursuits, and more importantly, they question how we engage with life more generally. Are we, like the fledgling and the cicada, so lodged in our own perspective, such that everything and everyone around us is evaluated only from where we sit? There is another set of figures that Zhuangzi uses to convey its ideas. These are people who do not conform to the values and practices of the day. They don't even look like ordinary people. I call them the misfits, although there are other ways of characterizing them. This is my word, not the Zhuangzi's. And as we will see, the Zhuangzi does everything it can to bring out the grotesqueness in these figures. But not just their grotesqueness, as we will see. In chapter 5 of the Zhuangzi, we find stories of people who are deemed less than normal. They have physical deformities, some which it seems they're born with, and there are others who are lacking a limb as a result of amputation as punishment for criminal acts. Before we proceed any further, let me qualify what I mean by words such as misfit, deformity, and of course disability, which is in the title of this evening's lecture. These words are not translations of words in the Zhuangzi and therefore not attributable to the text. However, the tone of the chapter and of stories elsewhere in the text involving people such as in Zhuangzi 5 suggests that this is the way they're perceived, at least by some, though not by the Zhuangzi's authors. The Zhuangzi itself uses language that specifically picks out how each misfit is different from the normal. And here I use normal in quotation marks as well, as that is also trying to capture the Zhuangzi's tone. In fact, Zhuangzi uses words that bear all. all of the deformities, so to speak, leaving little to the imagination. In chapter 5, some of the names that Zhuangzi uses to pick out these people are not their proper names. Many of them don't have proper names. The first one does, the others don't, as I'll show you. But the names capture in a really graphic way descriptions of these people's physical conditions. So there's Shushan at Uncle Mountain, the Tolas, and we'll look at this story in quite a bit of detail. There is this whole string in the Zhuangzi 5 again, an ugly man in Wei named Sad Horsehead Humpback. Hunchback, limp leg, the lipless cripple. Jar-size goiter, so, and we'll see one passage involving this person who's been characterized by the Zhuangzi as jar-sized goiter. There's one character, there's a whole string of words that describe him. He's from Zhuangzi chapter 4. Outspread the discombobulated. His chin was tucked into his navel, his shoulders tarred over the crown of his head. His ponytail pointed toward the sky. His 5 internal organs were compressed at the top of him. His thigh bones took the place of his ribs. And in the story, in chapter 4, Outspread the discombobulated was so discombobulated that when they drafted for the army, they left him alone and they fed him. And the story says, look, isn't it wonderful with these physical deformities, that with these physical lacks, that he gets looked after? What more if you have lacks in your virtuosity? So it uses the word virtuosity sometimes in a Confucian sense and sometimes in a Taoist sense. These are translations by Zipperin, and Zipperin says in the preface to his translation that he has deliberately kept these literal translations of the words because he thinks those are the intentions of the authors. In the Zhuangzi, these names, I believe, are just how these people are seen in the third person. I believe the authors of the Zhuangzi have deliberately not given them personal names to demonstrate what the perspective of normality entails. From this angle, the people in Zhuangzi 5 have no identity apart from their external deformed features or their disability, which make them deficient or less than human. But we'll see how in the stories Zhuangzi turns this around. So they're very unsettling, they're very confronting, and they put us at a position of great unease. I came across this painting, a 16th century painting, and there's quite a series of them by Zhou Chen, painting beggars and street characters. And Zhou Chen was depicting the suffering of beggars. It's quite interesting why he was painting beggars, because if you're an artist and you are selling your works to make a living, I don't know who's going to buy these paintings. Not rich patrons who would rather have their portraits painted, or beautiful sceneries, or gatherings of people in orderly settings. Some scholars believe that this painting depicts a typical scene at the end of the lunar year when the people who are considered less than human, who look like monsters, I'll come back to the idea of monsters, are gathered and they're paraded through the streets as an exorcism exercise to begin the new year with, so everything's cleaned. They gather these people so that there's a use for them once a year in to bid goodbye to the end of the lunar year. These are four more of the characters. They're just such wonderful paintings, and really in the 16th century. So there are actually 24 of them. 12 of them are in the Cleveland Museum of Art, and another 12 in the Honolulu Art Museum. I'm not sure why they've been split up, but that's where they can be found. It may seem anachronistic to use this illustration from the 16th century to discuss the figures in a Warring States text. However, Zhou Ten's drawings help draw attention to an important feature of the Zhuangzi's figures. They are ghost or demon-like. There is an insightful discussion of exactly this feature of the Zhuangzi's figures by Albert Galvani in his article, Radical Alterity in the Zhuangzi, on the political and philosophical function of monsters. That's the reference to Galvani's article. Galvani covers the Zhuangzi's use of monsters to disrupt how we see ourselves and how we understand the world. Although his piece is not the first to discuss this question of monsters, he specifically in his paper articulates how in using monsters as a part of the conversation, the Zhuangzi scrutinizes issues of inequality in the ethico-political dimension. Zhuangzi's monsters are described in grotesque terms to capture how collectively they have been left aside by society. From Galvani's point of view, the Zhuangzi's authors use these images of men seen as monsters to challenge existing inequalities in the political domain. This partly addresses a question I raised earlier concerning what ordinary men, ordinary activities, and less than ordinary people have to do in a text wishing to engage officials. It challenged their beliefs and practices. I'd like to mention one more aspect of these figures before we move on to look at a story involving one of them in conversation with Confucius. In the Zhuangzi, the deformed nature of these people is never just a physical lack. And here again, I use the word lack deliberately to capture a particular third-person perspective, namely of someone who sees the absence of a feature or the difference in a feature, for instance, someone having a large neck, as a disability or a shortcoming. From this perspective, the deformed nature of these people is never just a physical lack. Their physical imperfections were taken as outward manifestations of their moral inadequacy. They embodied their moral shortcomings. The Zhuangzi highlights the insidiousness of this perspective that effectively excluded an entire person on the basis of their having a perceived disability. Let's see how this plays out in a story involving Shushan the Toeless and Confucius, and also the figure of Lao Tzu. So in this story, Confucius is portrayed as humorless and lacking in insight, although Confucius fares well generally as a spokesperson in Zhuangzi 5. In this story, he doesn't fare particularly well. So Toeless has had his foot mutilated as punishment for a crime. And then he comes hobbling along. So the story is very, very graphic. He comes hobbling along to see Confucius, and Confucius says, you know, why have you come to see me? You know, you've come to me too late now. Confucius, in the opening part when he first encounters Toeless, basically kind of writes him off and sees his punishment, his amputation, as a very fitting evidence of his moral deficiency. There was this ex-con in Lu whose feet had been mutilated as a punishment. He healed his way over to see Confucius, who said to him, "You were careless in your past behavior and thus have ended up in this condition. Isn't it a little late to come to me now?" You can sense Confucius's tone. It is quite cold, noting that Tolles' moral deficiency is deservedly embodied and on full display. And this reflects the attitude to punishment as deterrent in those times. Confucius takes a morally elevated role as the adjudicator of Tolles' former actions, and he basically applies a yardstick. Tolles has been careless, that is, careless with his moral commitments. The implication, of course, is that Confucius himself is an exemplar on this same yardstick. And then finally, Confucius withdraws from further interaction with Tolles. His comment that Tolles has come too late has an apparent ring of finality about it. So Tolles then responds to Confucius, expressing disappointment about Confucius's judgment. Tolles was expecting warmer reception, given that here is someone repentant, wanting to come to learn from you. And Tolles says to Confucius, I just didn't understand where to direct my labors in the past, and undervalued my own body, and so I'm lacking a foot. But as I come to you now, I still have retained something worth more than a foot, which I'm trying to keep whole. Tolles insists that he's not entirely unworthy, challenging Confucius's withdrawal from him. He also challenges Confucius's perception of him as merely deficient. Don't look at what is missing, he's saying. The question of what is missing is, of course, itself a measure made from Confucius's vantage point of what is normal, what is missing from the normal. Tolles says, look at what is present, the repentant self. I'm good for something. And Tolles at the same time brings up the question of worth, that is his dignity and the character there, Jun. I deserve some respect. In what follows, Tolles takes the moral high ground and chides Confucius. Heaven covers all things, earth supports all things. I used to think you, sir, were just like heaven and earth. That's extremely high praise. I never imagined you would instead say something like this. So this is quite an argumentative strategy to put someone right up there. You used to think you were like this on the pedestal, but instead you've fallen way, way far beyond my expectations of you. Confucius lacks charity and flexibility in his assessment of Tolles' condition, says Tolles. And interestingly, we now see Confucius's response, and Confucius realizes the error in his harsh judgment of Tolles. Whereas earlier he seemed to withdraw from Tolles, he now tries to make amends by placing himself at a level inferior to Tolles, seeking to learn from Tolles. So he says, does a backflip. It was rude of me, won't you please come in and teach me what you've learned? So Confucius has clearly left him standing at the door. But Tolles went. The change in Confucius's attitude toward Tolles involves a shift in the way he views Tolles. The teacher, Confucius, seeks to be instructed by Tolles, but Tolles snubs him. The reason for this is played out as the story continues, as we will see later. For Confucius, however, being snubbed by Tolles does not seem to upset him. So the story now looks at Confucius and what he does next. It seems as if Tolles has departed. Confucius seems to try to regain his composure of a teacher. He then next goes to teach his disciples. Learn from Tolles, he says. My disciples. So Tolles is a one-footed ex-convict, yet he still endeavors to learn so as to make up for the ugliness of his past behavior. How much more should you do so, you who still have your intrinsic virtuosities whole and intact? There are a few points of interest in this part of the story. The role of teacher has moved back and forth between Confucius and Tolles, and Confucius regains his composure as teacher. Second, Confucius now includes Tolles among the worthy. His evaluation of Tolles now integrates Tolles into what Confucius regards as the potential, as a potential interactant. Tolles is now a model for Confucius's followers to consider, but it's also a model they can do, they consider, but they should be able to do better, according to Confucius. So he tells his followers, if toilers can endeavor to learn, they, with their virtuosities, intrinsic virtuosities, whole and intact, should be able to do even better. Here again, although we might have seen a glimmer of Confucius stepping away from his initial harsh judgment of toilers, ultimately he continues in his old ways, his ingrained ways of evaluating people according to his yardstick. So these habits don't get shed too easily, and we'll see that in the rest of the story. Tollus next goes on to tell Lao Dan. Lao Dan is the name of Lao Tzu, and Lao Dan is a revered figure in the Zhuangzi. Tollus next goes along to Lao Dan to share his experience of this very difficult conversation he's had with Confucius. Tollus said to Lao Dan, Confucius is certainly far from being an utmost person, isn't he? Why does he go around imitating you so subserviently? So here now, Confucius is desperate, trying to learn from Lao Dan. He must be seeking some bizarre, deceptive, illusory, freakish thing like a good name, not realizing that the utmost person views such things as handcuffs and leg chains. Tollus judges Confucius extremely harshly. He says that Confucius's moral preoccupations are petty and misguided. According to Tollus, Confucius seeks to imitate Lao Dan, and in doing so is just going about things the wrong way. It seems that just as Confucius had expected Tollus to have abided by a set of standards, Confucius himself expects to abide by a set of standards that he gathers or reflects on from Lao Dan. Confucius adheres to an approach that is guided by standards, and in doing so, slavishly binds himself to them. They are fetters for him. Lao Dan attempts to mediate this disagreement, and Lao Dan says, he doesn't say it's a bit harsh, but he asks Tollus, well, why don't you guide him? Why don't you guide Confucius? Lao Dan said, why don't you simply let him see life and death as a single stream, acceptable and unacceptable as a single thread, thus releasing him from his fetters. How would that be, do you think? For reasons not clear to us, Lao Dan advocates that Confucius should be guided to understand the subtleties and nuances of life situations, rather than relying on clear lines drawn between who or what belongs and who or what does not belong. So that's the reference to a single thread. Be more flexible in your approach. Don't draw such clean lines between who really must belong, and clearly on that, the way Confucius cuts up the moral world, so to speak, at least in the first instance, Tollus did not belong. So here is Tollus's response, and that's the end of the passage too. Tollus said, heaven itself has inflicted this punishment on Confucius. How can he be released? For reasons not clear to us, Tollus says Confucius' fetters are heaven's punishment. Tollus uses the language of fetters and punishment to caricature Confucius's moral commitment. Confucius does seem trapped. He's trapped in his entrenched approach to moral life, and he draws a line between what's acceptable and what is not. Tollus's comment highlights Confucius's imprisonment within his diminished view of morality and of his enslavement to his own moral ideals. We now turn to how these reflections so far can help us think about disability and a good life. As with many stories in the Zhuangzi, the story of the encounter between Tollus and Confucius encourages readers to take on different perspectives to see the situation from multiple perspectives. First, there's the perspective of Confucius, who can only see things from the vantage point of his own standards. At the beginnings of the story, he can only see Tollus's deficiencies and not his contrition. Second, as readers, we see Confucius and Tollus taking turns on the role of moral teacher as their conversation evolves. Then there is Confucius turning around saying, look, can you teach me? But then reverting to his old self. And then there's also the perspective of Lao Dan advocating a fair go for Confucius. And then we have Tolles, who claims that Confucius is unteachable. The idea of Confucius in fetters is surely Tolles' cheeky use of the language of punishment to caricature Confucius. How does perspective taking in this story help us think about disability? I suggest there are two important related ways arising from our discussion. First, taking on different perspectives of the Zhuangzi's author, or the author of this passage, of Tolles, the figure Confucius, compels us to think on how we measure and characterize disability by reference to our conceptions of what is normal. This reminds me of a compelling view in disability studies that understands how, in some cases, the idea of a disability arises from a collective view of what it means to be normal. And here is that view. Culture as Disability is the title of the article that I'm referencing. A disability may be a better display board for the weaknesses of a cultural system than it is an account of real persons. Sorry about that typo. It takes a whole culture of people producing idealizations of what everyone should be, and a system of measures for identifying those who fall short, for us to forget that we collectively produce our disabilities and the discomforts that conventionally accompany them. One cannot be disabled alone. That the idea of disability is collectively constructed in a culture harks back to the point that Albert Galvani makes about monsters, and how that image would have been used by authors of the Zhuangzi to foreground the inequalities in the socio-political domain. These lessons are not lost on us today. Secondly, the very exercise of thinking about what normal means for us and what disabled means for us triggers the question of whether we are able ourselves to take on different perspectives and to understand what the world looks like from there or elsewhere. Not all perspectives are equally sound according to the Zhuangzi, even though we can understand how one might have arrived at a particular point of view. There are stories in the Zhuangzi that make this point. There's a frog who lives in his well, who has a wonderful time in his little well, who can only grasp that his well is the best place to live. And there is the summer insect who does not know snow. Each has incomplete views as we see it. And the Zhuangzi's concern is not so much about the incompleteness of the views. In fact, I think the Zhuangzi makes the point that all views are incomplete, but rather the complacency on the part of the frog, for instance, that believes its view is the only plausible, if not the best view. And the frog in the well story is very much a children's story. There are many more little stories. Frog in the well. I don't want to be the frog in the well. These are covers of children's storybooks. Such complacency rings true in particular about perceptions of disability. Not only are assessments of disability often made from the vantage point of what is normal, they're undergirded by a complacency that the normal is the objectively correct place to be. The Zhuangzi brings out the theme of complacency in different ways and in different stories. We've seen the complacency of the fledgling and the cicada, of the figure Confucius in conversation with Tolles, the frog in the well, and of the summer insect. A figure of their complacency is their close-mindedness to seeing things from a range of perspectives. Close-mindedness is both epistemological and attitudinal. It's not just what we know or see, but what we refuse to look at or consider, and this is what the Zhuangzi captures well. The deficiencies of close-mindedness are amply articulated in scholarly debates, and many there are quite a few papers that look at its opposite, open-mindedness, as an intellectual virtue. At this point, I'd like to recommend Professor Mike Beattie's just published article entitled Open-Mindedness and Ajar-Mindedness in History of Philosophy in the journal Meta-Philosophy. It's open access, so you can get that easily. This article makes a case for open-mindedness among philosophers, and at least as importantly, institutionally within the profession and the discipline. To be ajar-minded is to leave the door open that is, to different cultural traditions in philosophy. Described in this way, this article might seem to be of interest only to professional philosophers. However, I believe its point about both open-mindedness and ajar-mindedness has a wider resonance. To close this discussion, I would like to share with you some imagery on how open-mindedness is manifest, especially in how the Zhuangzi sees disability. We return to Zhuangzi 5 and to two passages I want to share. The first involves hunchback limp leg, the lipless, and the person with the jar-sized goiter. The dukes who employ them see beyond their perceived deformities. So hunchback limp leg lipless is one person, and the person with the oversized goiter is the other. Hunchback limp leg, the lipless cripple, presented himself to Duke Ling of Wei, who was so delighted with him that when he saw the unimpaired, their necks looked freakishly long to him. So he must have done well in his official duties. Jar-sized goiter presented himself to Duke Huan of Qi, and in that case too, the ruler was so delighted that when he saw the unimpaired, their necks looked freakishly long to him. So it's not in this passage, but elsewhere in Zhuangzi 5, they're particularly adept at carrying out official duties, and that's why the dukes are impressed. Okay. Thus, where the intrinsic virtuosities excel, the physical form is forgotten. So Dukes Ling of Wei and Huan of Qi do not merely see beyond the perceived deformities, they do not see them. In fact, they begin to see otherwise, and they begin to take them as the normal. So they are for the dukes now, these two men, the new normal. And they forget. In the Zhuangzi, forgetting is a theme, and it's a positive something we should all strive for in terms of forgetting the norms that entrench us. The passage continues, when people do not merely forget the forgettable, but instead they forget the unforgettable, that is true forgetfulness. So this passage actually holds up these two dukes. It's not clear why Duke Ling and Duke Huan play such a favorable role in this story in the Zhuangzi. So in the closing statement, so the two of them, they do not merely forget the forgettable. So they're things that we forget, but they also forget, but instead they forget the unforgettable. They've put those assessments of disability behind them, and that is, they're held up as models of forgetfulness. These dukes are open-minded, so open-minded that they become used to the looks of these men. The second story is similar, but it speaks not from a third person, but from a first-person perspective. The first-person perspective is expressed by someone who is a recipient of another person's open-minded attitude towards him. Shen Tujia is an ex-criminal and is under the tutelage of a master. The master's name is Uncle Dim Nobody. Master Uncle Dim Nobody has a set of followers. There is a fellow pupil, Shen Tujia's fellow pupil, Zitan, who makes life very difficult for Shen Tujia, constantly reminding him of his criminal past and of his deformity, constantly saying, you only have one leg. Shen Tujia tires of Zitan and says to him, "Many two-footed people laugh at me for having one foot, which always used to infuriate me. But as soon as I arrived here at our master's place, everything fell away, bringing me back to where it started from. It's as if the master cleansed me with his goodness without my even realizing it. I've studied under him for 19 years, and never once in all that time have I been aware that I was one-footed." In the Zhuangzi, the passages I've shown utilize the strategy of perspective taking to demonstrate the effects of open-mindedness in our interactions with people who are perceived to be different, to be lacking in some way. The first passage articulates an admirable trait of forgetting, exemplified by the Jukes, that is, forgetting the expectations of normality when encountering another person. The second expresses the experiences of a person who is a recipient of another's open-minded attitude, such that he himself forgets that he has to navigate the world on one leg. In the Zhuangzi, the issues of disability and deformity arise from an ableist culture that conjoins physical with moral perfection, and likewise physical with moral imperfection. The text deliberately highlights how unsatisfactory these angles on life are. Notwithstanding the unvarnished language used, or perhaps precisely because of the unvarnished language used, the stories remind us of how uncomfortable life is for people who are deemed disabled or deformed, and how wrong that is. But it also warns us that we should not ourselves be disabled by the fetters we've created for ourselves by being close-minded. Indeed, in the story of Tholas and Confucius, the Confucius figure is the one with the disability. But the Zhuangzi's view on perceived disability is not merely a negative proposal of not imposing our convictions on all others. It also offers a positive vision of providing support that is enabling. It is important in closing to note that the title of Zhuangzi 5 is De Chong Fu, and it carries the character De, which I translated virtuosity earlier. And I've translated the title as Signs of Virtuosity in Abundance. So character is, that's the virtuosity, Chong is full, and Fu are signs or markers of virtuosity. I find it deeply touching that a chapter with monsters bears a title that signals virtuosity in abundance. Thank you.